Judaism is not in the Old Testament. Modern scholarship makes increasingly clear that the religion described in the Old Testament is not Judaism, in the sense that later tradition or modern readers understand the term. The idea of a unified, abstract religious system called Judaism, defined by halakhic interpretation, rabbinic authority, and non-sacrificial worship, did not exist during the biblical period. Instead, it emerged centuries later, long after the Old Testament was written and long after the historical figure of Moses. Scholars such as Daniel Boyarin, Christine Hayes, and Isaiah Gafni emphasize that there is no term meaning Judaism in biblical or Second Temple Hebrew. The first appearance of a word meaning Judaism as a religious system is Yahadut in rabbinic literature. The term Yahadut appears for the first time in the late Tanaitic or early Amoraic periods, roughly between the late 2nd century and the early 4th century CE. This places the invention of the concept more than a millennium after Moses, who is traditionally dated to the 13th century BCE. Even using the most conservative timelines, the rabbinic category of Yahadut emerged approximately 1,400 to 1,600 years after the events described in the 5 books of Moses. This fact alone demonstrates that Judaism in its later sense was not, and could not have been, the religion of Moses or the Israelites of the Old Testament. The Old Testament describes a religious system built around the sacrificial cult conducted by the Levitical and Aaronic priesthood at a designated sacred site. The religious world of the 5 books of Moses is governed by ritual offerings, purity laws, and the authority of priests and prophets. Worship centers on sacrificial acts, and religious identity is tied to tribal lineage and sacred geography. The 5 books of Moses present no concept of an abstract, text-centered religious identity. The Israelites do not practice halakhic casuistry, synagogue life, or continuous scholarly interpretation. The religion of ancient Israel is concrete, cultic, and priestly. Rabbinic Judaism, however, arose only after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, when sacrifices ended and the priesthood ceased to function. In the centuries following this crisis, especially between 70 CE and 300 CE, rabbinic sages developed a new religious system based on halakhic reasoning, prayer in place of sacrifice, and the authority of learned scholars rather than hereditary priests. It is within this post-temple world that Yahadut first appears. The word denotes a coherent religious identity shaped by rabbinic interpretation, an identity entirely foreign to the religion described in the 5 books of Moses. Despite these differences, the rabbis insisted that their system represented the true continuation of biblical Israelite religion. To sustain this claim, they reinterpreted the Old Testament through rabbinic categories. Laws originally intended for priests became subjects of scholarly debate. Sacrificial commandments were spiritualized or framed as theoretical ideals, and the biblical cult was reshaped to resemble a synagogue-centered religious life that did not yet exist. The rabbis thus projected their own worldview backward, creating the impression of continuity between their post-temple system and the ancient religion practiced in the 5 books of Moses, even though Yahadut itself would not appear until more than 1,000 years after Moses. Acknowledging this chronological gap is essential to understanding both the Old Testament and Rabbinic Judaism accurately. The invention of the term Yahadut in the 2nd–4th centuries CE reveals that Judaism as a formal religious category belongs to the rabbinic reinterpretation of Israel's past, not to the religion depicted in the 5 books of Moses. Using the word Judaism for the ancient Israelite religion imposes a later theological framework onto a far earlier and fundamentally different system. In short, Judaism is not in the Old Testament. What the 5 books of Moses describe is the religion of ancient Israel, a sacrificial, priestly, temple-oriented form of worship that the rabbis, more than a millennium after Moses, reimagined and retroactively absorbed into a new concept called Yahadut. Understanding this historical development allows each period's religious worldview to be seen clearly on its own terms, rather than merged into a retrospective continuity created only in late antiquity.